of the World Bank's biannual publication, Pakistan Development Update. My name is Ariba Shahid, and I'm a business and economic journalist at Profit Magazine. And I also work as a contributor at Deal Street Asia, where I write about the exciting Pakistani startup and venture capital ecosystem. Now, let's move back to the program. The Pakistan Development Update covers the recent economic developments and the macroeconomic projections for the near term. In this edition, the special focus of the report is on inflation in Pakistan and its impact on the poor. As a citizen, most people have borne the brunt of inflation over the past few months, and that is why this topic is more relevant than ever. We hope the readers will find the support timely and the analysis useful in context of the current economic conditions and the impact of the recent devastating floods that have added to the situation at hand. The event is being streamed on multiple platforms, so you can watch us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and also the accounts of on the accounts of Tabat Lab and also on the World Bank accounts. The links are now appearing on your screen. So, whichever platform you're joining in from, please be sure to join the discussion and make this a two-way communication process. Post your comments and questions. And if you enjoyed the discussion, please do not forget to use our hashtags PTU Fall 2022 or Inflation in Pakistan, which are also appearing on the screen right now. So let's keep this two-way. Now, let's formally begin. So, discuss the key findings of the report. We have colleagues from the World Bank joining us who will deliver two presentations. Following these two presentations, we will take questions from you guys. And for the special section of the report on inflation and the poor, we have a moderate panel discussion followed by a question and answer session. I encourage all of you to participate, post your questions, and I will promise you to try to take as many questions as I possibly can. So, to kick things off, I invite the World Bank Director for Pakistan, Naji, to open the event. Over to you, Naji.
Okay, thank you very much, Ariba. Salam alaikum, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this virtual launch of the October 2022 edition of the Pakistan Development Update titled Inflation and the Poor. We produce these updates twice a year, usually in the run-up to the annual meetings and spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF, which are to start next week in Washington, D.C. I would like to extend my gratitude to the speakers who have graciously agreed to be part of today's launch and are connected online to this event. Dr. Murtaza Sayed, Deputy Governor for Policy at the State Bank of Pakistan. Thank you, Murtaza, for joining. Dr. Asma Haider, who's the Dean of the School of Economics and Social Sciences at IBA in Karachi. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. Mr. Fida Hussain, who's the Director of Monetary Policy Department at the State Bank of Pakistan. Dr. Nasser Iqbal, and thank you, Mr. Fida. Dr. Nasser Iqbal, who's an Associate Professor at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics in Islamabad. Thank you, Professor. And Mrs. Ariba Shahid, thank you for the introduction and for moderating this event today. This development update comes at a crucial time for Pakistan. As we are all aware, the economy was already in a vulnerable state before the catastrophic flooding events that we are still going through. Macroeconomic policy settings had been loosened at the end of the COVID crisis to help the recovery and allow the economy to recover and grow rapidly. And this over the recent years had led to um, a boost in growth following these expansionary policies, but it led to large external and fiscal deficits, as we have seen before in the economic history of Pakistan with these boost and burst cycles, and these and therefore Pakistan had limited room to deal with the recent deterioration of the global economic conditions, including increasing food and fuel prices, as well increasing global interest rates. But the government took decisive measures to address imbalances earlier in the year. Amid continued monetary tightening, by the State Bank of Pakistan, the government passed a contractionary FY23 budget and reversed costly and unsustainable energy price relief packages that were launched before that. This allowed the IMF program to come back on track, as you all know, and set the economy on the path of macroeconomic stability. But fiscal space remained limited, and debt remained high, and foreign exchange reserves remained at low levels, uncomfortable levels. And now the floods are posing new risks and come as this huge exogenous shock. And as the development update that is published today shows, flooding is expected to have enormous human and economic costs, and has been documented by the authorities themselves. And disruptions to the economy, especially in agriculture, will reduce output. Government will need to manage enormous relief and recovery needs as it started to respond, of course, to this crisis, but in a context where fiscal space is very limited. And in addition to that, disruptions to exports and increasing import needs, especially because some crops production has been wiped out by the floods, especially in Sindh, will exert additional pressures on the current account deficit, and markets remain sensitive to these economic developments and associated policy decisions. So, facing a major shock like this one, and with very few policy buffers available, Pakistan now faces a very narrow path to stability, and of course international assistance in this context will be important, but also sound economic management and keeping progress on structural reforms will be a must for this critical path to the government's response to keep stability ahead of us. This means taking action in several areas. First, maintaining confidence and business sentiment through sound overall macroeconomic management, including continued monetary and fiscal constraints and maintaining a flexible exchange rate. Second, carefully targeting relief measures towards those most in need. This should involve expanding social protection, as the government has done through the Benazir Income Support Program and the special cash transfer of 25,000 rupees that has been targeted to households in affected districts, but also removing trade barriers and that are constraining access to vital household goods. As we show in the report published today, blanket energy subsidies should be avoided and should be better targeted to those most in need, because blanket subsidies disproportionately benefit the better off while imposing very large and unsustainable fiscal costs. Third and finally, maintaining momentum with structural reforms, including in energy sector, so as to support increased resilience, productivity, and incomes in the medium term. I would even say that in face of such an exogenous shock to the economy, accelerating these reforms to reduce distortions, to make savings, to create fiscal buffers, to make to collect even more to collect more fiscal revenues to be able to finance the emerging needs in not only in the relief but in the reconstruction period is absolutely critical. So it's even more than ever. It's even more urgent to move ahead on these structural reforms in different areas like the business environment, fiscal, and power sector reforms. So I would like now to invite Dr. Murtaza Said, the Deputy Governor for Policy at the State Bank of Pakistan, to provide the keynote address. And I would like to congratulate the team and thank them for an excellent report. Dr. Murtaza, over to you, and thank you again for joining the event today. Over.
Thank you very much, Naji, and good afternoon to everybody on this Zoom on this call. I'd like to thank the World Bank and Tabad Lab for putting today's event together. It's a pleasure to be here at the launch of the World Bank's Pakistan Development Update for October. I have to say, I read the update and the special section on inflation. I got a sneak preview of it a couple of days ago. It's very well done, and I'd like to congratulate the authors. As Naji highlighted in his remarks, this is an exceptionally difficult time for the global economy. We've had shock upon shock coming out of COVID. in the last year and a half. We've had global commodity prices rise. We've had inflation reach multi-year highs. We've had geopolitical tensions with Russia, Ukraine. And domestically in Pakistan too, we've had a very, very tough period in the last year or so with political uncertainty and now, of course, with the devastating floods. And of course, fears about Pakistan's macroeconomic outlook have now reached a crescendo. So, what I'd like to do in my remarks today is to cover three main areas. First, I'd like to describe the main challenges that Pakistan is facing this year, fiscal year 2023, which the development update also talks about. Secondly, I would like to talk a little bit about how the state bank and the government are responding to the challenges that we will face over the next 12 months. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I think Pakistan will be able to navigate those challenges successfully. And some of the worst fears about Pakistan's external financing, Pakistan's reserves, Pakistan's external debt situation, we feel are overblown. And markets hopefully will come to recognize that in the coming months. So, Bisma, if you could please load the presentation that I had. I have a few slides that I'd like to use to illustrate my remarks. First of all, just to describe the challenges that Pakistan is facing, one thing to, of course, note is that Pakistan is not alone in facing high inflation and high global commodity prices as a major challenge in the current context. On the left-hand side, you can see that inflation in a number of advanced economies as well as emerging markets is ratcheting up quite fast. It's approaching highs that we have not seen in many, many years. And on the right-hand side, you can see that as global commodity prices have risen in the recovery from COVID and the supply-demand dislocations that have come with it, we're also seeing that the current account deficits of a number of commodity importers are coming under pressure. Pakistan is shown in red in figure 2 on the right, but you can see there are a bunch of other countries too that are facing current account deficits that are much larger than we have seen recently. One point that we should add, though, is that in addition to this global factor, Pakistan has also been growing very, very fast in the aftermath of COVID. We had a very shallow recession in Pakistan. The economy only contracted by 1 percentage point in 2020. That was a relatively shallow recession compared to most parts of the world. And since then, we have rebounded very fast. We had 6% growth in fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22. And what we're showing you here is that Pakistan's cumulative growth over this period of about 11% puts it right on top of countries across the world post-COVID. So we've had a very vigorous rebound since COVID. That has also added to demand-side pressures on inflation and the current account. So it's partly a global story, but also a story of a very fast rebound in the domestic economy in Pakistan's case that has led to high inflation and current account deficit problems in Pakistan. What we're showing you here is inflation. Like other countries in the world, Pakistan too has seen inflation ratchet up quite a bit. In particular, since June of this year, we have seen inflation almost double from 13-14% previously to about 25-27% more recently. And this is largely because of global commodity prices, but also because of the welcome reversal of energy subsidies that were announced in February. As Naji was pointing out in his remarks, it's actually quite a good thing that we're allowing costs to be passed on now. But of course, that leads to a ratcheting up in energy inflation, which is shown in the blue bars here. But we also have seen quite rapid rises in food price inflation, shown in green, as well as core inflation, shown in yellow. So we do have an inflation problem in Pakistan as well. More recently, inflation has started to come down. We think it's kind of peaked now and will start to slowly come down over the rest of the year, and then gradually, in fact, quite fast in the next fiscal year, start to come back and converge to the 5 to 7% medium-term target range that we have because of beneficial base effects, because of tight macroeconomic policies, and based on the futures prices of global commodity prices. Another problem that we've had is the current account. What we're showing you here is the current account in billions of dollars. And you can see that it widened quite a bit in fiscal year 21, the year that ended in June. And we started tightening at the central bank in about September of last year. We started raising interest rates, the policy rate. And we saw that the current account deficit did start to shrink between January and April. After that, unfortunately, there was quite a large fiscal stimulus unplanned that was imparted into the economy through the energy subsidies. So we saw the current account deficit start to rise again between April and June. But again, the last 2 or 3 months, we've seen the current account deficit again coming under control as macro policy tightening has resumed. Um, Now, why do we think that going forward, Pakistan's macroeconomic challenges will be successfully navigated? This is my second point. The first thing to notice is that compared to the past, we are behaving in a very different way. Sorry, something seems to have gone wrong with this chart, but what it's supposed to show you is on the top the current account deficits that we've had in Pakistan, which are the red bars, and at the bottom the blue bars are the reserve situations. And the main takeaway from this is that the last time we had a current account surge in Pakistan, it was around the middle of 2016. It took 2 years before the policy rate was raised, and it took 2 years before the exchange rate was allowed to move to depreciate. And in the meantime, the current account deficit kept getting bigger and reserves kept falling. This time in Pakistan, we saw the current account deficit start to rise in about the middle of last year. And very quickly, since then, we have allowed interest rates, the policy rate to rise. You've seen quite a vigorous tightening. And in response, the current account is adjusting, as I just showed you in the last chart. And we've also allowed the exchange rate to depreciate as it should in response to current account pressures, playing its role as the natural shock absorber that has also helped us preserve reserves relative to the past. So we're behaving very differently now than we did in the past. We're allowing both the exchange rate and the policy rate to respond to our pressures, and that is beginning to yield results. Uh, Even in a cross-country context, what we are showing you here on the y-axis is the policy rate across a bunch of emerging and advanced economies. And on the right-hand side, on the x-axis, we're showing you the latest inflation reading. Pakistan is the dot right at the top, the right-hand side. And you can see that compared to the trend that we are seeing in terms of the relationship between the policy rate and inflation across the world, Pakistan sits very nicely on that trend line, indicating that we are doing quite well from a cross-country perspective as well in terms of monetary policy tightening. One other thing that we're doing, which is quite welcome, is that this year, after an unplanned fiscal stimulus in fiscal year 22, you can see the primary deficit got larger in fiscal year 22. It was supposed to contract according to the budget. This year, in fiscal year 23, the budget is being consolidated again, and there's quite a large fiscal consolidation that's planned this year. Fiscal consolidation of about 2.5% of GDP should also help bring the demand pressures on inflation and the current account down. Now, of course, all of what I showed you was before taking into account the floods. And as the Pakistan Development Update from the World Bank shows, that is quite likely to have an impact on Pakistan's will be around 2% after the floods, because agriculture in particular will be affected. That's what the development update says. That's what most people are thinking as well. In terms of inflation, before the floods, headline inflation average was going to be between 18 to 20%. That was the forecast that the State Bank had. And the current account deficit was going to be a little bit lower than 3% of GDP. This was also the forecast of the IMF. Going forward, we'll have to watch how things evolve. On the one hand, food prices could surprise on the upside following the floods. On the other hand, global commodity prices have eased quite a bit, and futures prices are also down. And also the fact that growth is going to be lower may mean that both inflation and the current account deficit, there are also some downside risks associated with this depressed growth and global commodity prices. So we'll have to see how inflation and the current account pan out over the next 12 months or so. In terms of reserves, before the floods, they were expected to double from their current level of about 8 billion to 16 billion. We'll have to see what happens to the current account. If the current account remains bounded, then these reserves projections should remain relatively intact. One thing that we can see is that Pakistan is no stranger to natural disasters, unfortunately, and to shocks. What this chart shows you is that Pakistan has been through an earthquake back in 2005-6. We also had flooding in 2010. We had the COVID recession that happened in 2020, 2021. In all of those cases, Pakistan's growth rebounded relatively quickly, and our inflation actually trended down after the shocks. Something else that we've seen in terms of the current account is that typically Pakistanis living outside Pakistan tend to remit more into the economy after there's a shock, either a natural disaster or an economic shock. And also, of course, international aid tends to help when there is a natural disaster. And typically, the current account has remained bounded in the aftermath of such shocks. This gives us confidence that perhaps going forward as well, the current account deficit should remain range bound, even though we've had this shock. In terms of our why we think Pakistan um, uh, will be able to navigate the challenges successfully and the fears about the outlook are a little bit exaggerated. Let's first talk about the external financing needs that Pakistan will have. That's showed on the left hand side. The total is about $31 billion. And as you can see on the right hand side, the available financing is $37 billion. So we're overfinanced by $6 billion. This is before taking into account the flood. Now, the flood may have some impact, on, of course, on the current account deficit, but recall that we're already overfinanced by about $6 billion. And more recently, we have received additional financing pledges from the ADB, the AIIB, Qatar, and the Saudis of $4 billion. So we have a cushion of $10 billion in terms of how much more external financing requirements we can actually absorb. In terms of the reserve situation, we do expect the reserves to go up to $16 billion by the end of the fiscal year. We think that path will remain relatively intact, given that the current account deficit, we think, will be relatively contained, and we have this extra external financing that has been pledged by our friendly countries and our development partners. Finally, let me just show you a couple of slides on why I think the external debt vulnerability of Pakistan is not as severe as some people are speculating. First of all, if you look at Pakistan's debt to GDP, it's actually relatively contained compared to emerging markets. Pakistan is shown in green; it's less than 70% of GDP. That's quite low compared to emerging markets. The second thing to note is that Pakistan's external debt as a percent of GDP is also relatively contained. It's a little bit over 30% of GDP. That's relatively small compared to other emerging markets. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the short-term external debt for Pakistan is also very low. Only about 6% of our total external debt is short-term in nature. So that also provides us some cushion. And typically what gets you into trouble is if you owe a lot of your external debt to private sector creditors. In Pakistan's case, we only owe about 20% of our external debt to private sector creditors. The vast majority of our external debt is sourced from multilateral institutions, from bilateral partners, both Paris Club and non-Paris Club, and therefore our external debt vulnerabilities are a lot lower. Also, if you think about the external debt dynamics going forward, Pakistan's external financing requirements, while they are high compared to our own past, on the left-hand side, you can see that they're actually not that high compared to many other emerging markets. And in terms of the debt dynamics, the R minus G, which is the real interest rate minus the growth rate of the economy shown in the middle panel, is actually quite favorable compared to other emerging markets. And so is the primary balance going forward. These two things are very important for debt dynamics. Both of those Pakistan does relatively well. And finally, I will just say that the fact that Pakistan has an IMF program also means that we are in a relatively good place when it comes to navigating the very difficult challenges that we have. Here, what we show you is that a number of the other countries that have relatively high government bond yields right now don't even actually have an IMF program. They're not engaged with the IMF. And therefore, Pakistan, given the fact that it is in an IMF program, has more degrees of freedom and also has a very important umbrella during this very difficult time for the global economy. Let me just leave it at that and thank the organizers again and look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
And for setting the context for today's discussion, we are now going to play a short video summarizing the main message of the special section of the report titled Inflation and the Poor. So, video.
Inflation in Pakistan has risen rapidly over the past year. Prices for food and energy have been rising all over the world. In Pakistan, the depreciating rupee and an overheating economy further drove up prices. To make matters worse, the recent catastrophic floods have damaged crops and livestock, disrupted supply chains, and restricted access to markets. All these factors will continue to exert upward pressure on prices, particularly on food items. It is important to understand that inflation affects households differently due to differences in consumption patterns and income. Relatively poorer households are more exposed to food inflation, whereas better off households will experience the effects of higher energy and fuel prices more strongly. This is because households with the lowest income spend almost half of their budget on food-related items. On the other hand, for the richest households, food makes up less than a third of their budget, and they spend significantly more on fuel and transport than low-income households. As a result, inflation driven by higher food prices disproportionately impacts the relatively poor. So what should policymakers do to contain these inflationary pressures while also protecting the most vulnerable segments of the population? First, Pakistan needs a coherent and prudent monetary and fiscal policy to help stabilize prices. Policymakers can also use sectorial policies with sustainable fiscal cost and large benefits to poor households, such as reducing import duties on sensitive food products. By temporarily expanding well-targeted social protection programs, we can help provide poorer households with a cushion in these tough times. Since food and energy prices are the main drivers of inflation, enhancing production and improving efficiency in these sectors can help ensure price stability in the longer term. To find out more, read the complete Pakistan Development Update for October 2022.
Okay, so I now invite Derek Chen, senior economist at the World Bank, to deliver a presentation on the recent economic developments in Pakistan and the World Bank's macroeconomic projections. To the audience, I'd just like to remind you guys that you can send in your questions. So over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Ariba, and good afternoon to everyone. Can we show the slides, please? Thank you. So after COVID hit the world in 2022, we see that the Pakistan's economic growth rebounded both in FY fiscal year 21 and 22. Overall, we saw very broad-based growth, with agriculture, industry, and services all growing at pandemic highs. In particular, the agriculture sector growth was 4.4%, which was a 70-year high, broadly due to overall good weather as well as strong livestock production. The strong growth that we saw in the past 2 years is partly due to supportive macroeconomic policy that fueled aggregate demand. On the left figure, what we're plotting is the real interest rate, which is actually the difference between the policy rate and the inflation rate. And we see that for most of the pandemic period, the real interest rate was negative, implying very low borrowing costs. On the right-hand side, we have the overall fiscal deficit as well as the primary deficit, which is indicative of fiscal policy. And we see that it was largely expansionary, particularly in FY22, fiscal year 22, where the deficit hit 7.9% of GDP and the primary deficit was 3.1% of GDP. This strong growth came at the cost of economic imbalances. On the left-hand figure, which plots the current account deficit, we see that the current account deficit hit 17.3 US dollars a billion in FY22, equivalent to 4.6% of GDP, which was a 4-year high. The large current account deficit, together with high debt servicing plus political and policy uncertainty, weakened sentiment, and this contributed to sharp weakening of the Pakistani rupee, which depreciated more than 23% in FY22. This correspondingly led to pressure on reserves, which fell to 1.5 months of import cover at the end of the fiscal year. At the same time, there were domestic imbalances as well, where the inflation rate rose to 12.2%, which was an 11-year high. With the high inflation rate and the large current account deficit, the state bank began tightening the policy rate beginning from September 2021 and raised the policy rate accumulative 800 basis points. Today, the policy rate is at 15%. However, with the inflation rate higher at 20 over percent, the interest rate, the policy rate, sorry, the real interest rate is still negative. At the same time, to complement the tight monetary stance, the government passed a contractionary fiscal budget for FY23, targeting a primary surplus of 0.2% of GDP for this current fiscal year. However, in June, there was severe flooding that led to a lot of damages, particularly in the agricultural sector. We know that 9.4 million acres of cultivated land is estimated to have impacted, and a large number of livestock as well has been estimated loss. Apart from damage to the agriculture sector, there were also damages to infrastructure, human capital, and personal assets. The damage in the agriculture sector is also expected to spill over into industry and the services sector activities. Local textile industry constitutes about 25%, a quarter of industrial output, and more than half of goods exports. And domestic cotton is a large component of the input into the local textiles industry. At the same time, due to reduced crop production, as well as the loss of livestock, the food processing and slaughtering industries are also expected to be affected. Together, lower agricultural and industrial activity could also affect the services sector through the wholesale and transportation services that make up about 50% of the entire services sector. The floods will also exacerbate pressures in the external sector. Food and cotton imports are expected to rise to mitigate local shortages. At the same time, due to reduced shipments of rice, a key export, as well as lower output and export of textiles. From past experiences, as mentioned by Dr. Mandazar, in times of crisis, we do see remittances and foreign aid increasing, so we expect the wider trade deficit to be partly mitigated by stronger remittance inflows as well as international aid. At the same time, due to temporary shortages, and challenges in transportation around the country, inflation has been increasing. Fiscal pressures are also likely to worsen because there are expected expenditures to be likely to increase with relief measures at both the federal and provincial levels. At the same time, revenues are likely to fall with smaller tax bases, and there's also a temporary relief on custom duties for food. Overall, the macro impact of floods is large. Pakistan's economy was already weakened with twin deficits, high inflation above 20%, and little external buffers before the floods. With the floods, the agricultural sector is now likely to contract, which is the first time in over 2 decades, leading to substantially slower economic growth for the country as a whole. We expect fiscal policy to remain largely expansionary due to the relief and recovery efforts. And this will likely require international aid to help finance the unanticipated expenditures. Overall, what we have right now in for the macroeconomic outlook is that for fiscal year 23, this current fiscal year, we expect real GDP growth to slow to around 2%, less than a third of of the 6% we saw in FY22. Inflation, we expect it to increase to around 23% this year due to flood disruptions, higher domestic energy prices, as well as the weaker rupee. For the current account balance, despite a wider trade deficit, we project higher remittance inflows, and this will help to narrow the current account deficit to 4.3% of GDP, slightly smaller than the 4.6% we saw last year. For the fiscal balance, we expect the fiscal deficit to decrease by 1 percentage point of GDP to around 6.9% of GDP this fiscal year. This is in part due to a reduction of subsidy expenditures as compared to last year. The debt as a share to GDP is also expected to shrink due to the faster growth of nominal GDP. Overall, in summary, we think that the floods has a devastating impact on the economic outlook as well as the prospects for fiscal consolidation. The government right now needs to respond adequately to extensive relief and recovery needs. At the same time, the economy still needs to be cooled down and at the same time also to regain fiscal sustainability. We think that the government should consider fully aligning with sound economic management practices, such as having coherent and prudent monetary and fiscal policies, articulate and adhere to a very clear strategy for economic recovery. This will help restore investor confidence and sentiment. At the same time, maintain progress on structural reforms, such as those in the power sector, which has very strong repercussions on macro and fiscal sustainability. With that, thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Ariba.
Thank you, Derek. So, just a reminder to our viewers, if you have any questions for the World Bank team, don't forget to post them in the comment section. And another reminder is, if you want to give your feedback, if you're enjoying the session, please don't forget to use our hashtags PDU Fall 2022 and inflation in Pakistan. Hashtag inflation in Pakistan. They're on the screen right now. All right, so I now invite Moritz Mayer, senior economist at the World Bank, to talk about the special section of the report, Inflation and the Poor. Over to you, Moritz.
On.
Hi, Moritz. Can you hear me? Hi, perfect. Let's go.
With
So Moritz, we can't hear you right now. We seem to have some technical difficulty happening on your end. Um, In the meanwhile, the hashtags are on the screen again. PDU Fall 2022, inflation in Pakistan. So we're really looking forward to your feedback. I hope you all are enjoying the interesting insights that our team is showing you. So while we wait, just another reminder again, the hashtags are on the screen. Also, just to point out that Derek Chen's session, you're allowed to ask questions. And in addition to that, after Morit's session, we're going to have a question answer session where you can ask Derek and Moritz questions. So I'm really looking forward to that. Bring in all your tough questions. Bring in all the questions you have related to inflation. It's a problem that it's a phenomenon that nearly everyone in Pakistan is facing. The degrees, however, vary based on what income bracket you belong to, your consumption patterns, your spending patterns. Um, so yeah. In the meanwhile, let me ask Moritz again if he can hear me. Hi, Moritz, can you hear me? We seem to have he seemed to have disconnected for the time being. We have him up again, but there seems to be some technical difficulty. So apologies on that part. Hi, Moritz. Good to see you.
Good afternoon, Ariba. This is Morris. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. So apologies for these disruptions. I'm looking forward to the session. Good afternoon to our distinguished guests and good afternoon to all of you who are connected. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Morris Mayer, and it is my pleasure to present joint work with Shabana Kishwar, Muhammad Nasir, and Lucy Pan on inflation and the poor. May I ask for the slides to please be projected? No, it should be the slides on inflation and the poor, please. Yeah. I can't control the slides. Can you please move to the next slide? Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. So why do we care about inflation? In a nutshell, inflation impacts everybody. Let it be firms which need to take investment decisions during times of quickly changing prices, or households which experience rising cost of living. Inflation matters for growth and investment and has a direct impact on household welfare. In this context, the special topic of the Pakistan Development Update explores trends and drivers of inflation, describes the impact of inflation with a particular focus on households, and outlines policy options on how to respond to inflationary pressure. Next slide, please. Over the past year, inflation in Pakistan rose rapidly, breaking from past trends. Prior to 2019, inflation was relatively stable and below 10%. Since then, monthly inflation rates have risen sharply, with the national inflation rate increasing from 9.0% in September 2021 to 27.3% in August 2022. Next slide, please. For both urban and rural areas in Pakistan, higher food and energy prices underpinned increase in inflation. This reflects three major drivers. First, external factors, including rising demand during the post-COVID period, while supply only adjusted slowly, and the war in Ukraine, which added further volatility and uncertainty, especially in markets where Russia and Ukraine are significant suppliers of agricultural products, fertilizers, and energy. Second factor which contributed to inflation is domestic economic conditions and policy settings. We do see that an expansionary fiscal policy and a delayed monetary response led to an economic overheating. More recently, the devastating floods had a profound impact on inflation in Pakistan. Agricultural losses and disruptions to supply chains further exerted upward pressure on inflation. Next slide, please. Empirical studies covering a large number of countries have highlighted the adverse effects of inflation, especially during episodes of quickly rising prices and high volatility of prices. Next slide, please. For firms, higher inflation discourages investment decisions by creating uncertainty about future returns. Inflation also leads to investment decisions, investments in less efficient or unproductive assets due to an erosion of trust in the national currency as a store of value. Finally, inflation can erode external competitiveness by appreciating the real exchange rate, making the country's exports more expensive. Among all dimensions, this has a negative impact on growth and investments. For households, higher inflation leads to a decline of the real purchasing power through rising consumer prices and decreasing real incomes, especially if wages and transfers are sticky and not adjusted frequently. The effects on asset prices depend on the net asset position of households, or more specifically, if a household is a creditor or a debitor. Moreover, the impact of inflation on household welfare depends on the ease with which shock-responsive social safety net systems, both private and public, can be expanded during times of crisis. For this special topic, we focus on the impact of inflation on household welfare. Next slide, please. Households differ in their characteristics, level of income, and consumption patterns. Data from the National Household Survey in Pakistan suggests that the poor spend on average 50% of their budget on food and non-alcoholic beverages, compared to less than 30% for the richest households. Moreover, we see that the poor spend on average 19% on housing and utilities, while this share increases to more than 27% for the top of the income distribution. Given that consumption patterns differ between poor and rich households, and with different price trends across categories of goods and services, inflation rates also differ across households. Next slide, please. As spending on food account for a higher share of total spending among the poor, during times of quickly rising food prices, poor households experience higher inflation rates. Our results suggest that between November 2018 and August 2022, the poorest households, which is the first decile, on average experienced a 1 percentage point higher inflation rate than the richest household. Next slide, please. In addition, drivers of inflation differ between relatively poorer and richer households. For this analysis, we again used the National Household Survey to sort households into 10 bins based on their consumption level. The first decile, to the very left of this figure, represents the poorest 10% of households, and so on. For August 2022, the level of inflation does not differ much across the income distribution, but drivers of inflation do. For the poorest, inflation has mainly been driven by higher food prices, whereas for richer households, it was housing, utilities, and transport. Rising food prices accounted for more than 50% of inflation among the poor, compared to 30% among the rich. To the top of the income distribution, rising prices for housing, utilities, and transport account for almost 50% of their inflation. Next slide, please. Yes, inflation reduces real purchasing power for all households, but welfare losses are higher among the poor. Since the poor only have limited savings, at best, they either reduce their total consumption or switch to lower quality goods and services. In the short term, this reduces their household welfare. There's also a long-term cost of rising inflation. Evidence from around the world shows that during episodes of high inflation, nutrition outcomes among the poor deteriorate, and families take their children out of school. It is evident that these coping strategies undermine human development outcomes and create risks for future poverty reduction and inclusive growth. Next slide, please. Next, we discuss policy options to contain inflationary pressure while also protecting the poor and vulnerable. Next slide, please. The Pakistan Development Update outlines policy options which can be grouped into 4 categories, and all of them speak to the broader issue of fiscal and social sustainability. First, implement a coherent and prudent monetary and fiscal policy. This includes maintaining the independence of the State Bank of Pakistan, combined with proactive and data-driven monetary policy making to support price stability. It also includes sustaining fiscal discipline to prevent excessive aggregate demand pressures that drive inflation. Second, undertake sectoral policies with sustainable fiscal cost that largely benefit poor households. For instance, using trade policies to reduce prices of sensitive food products, which constitute a higher share of spending among the poor. Or maintaining progress with the removal of general subsidies, such as the energy price relief measures, but also avoiding general reductions in taxes that would deprive the government of revenues. Third, mitigate the impact on poor households through well-targeted and temporary expansions of social protection programs. Lastly, enhance economy-wide productivity growth, which in the medium and long term also raises incomes. This includes removing distortions to enhance the efficiency in the allocation of labor and capital. And in the context of higher food and energy prices, this also relates to reforms in the agriculture and energy sector, which reduce inflationary pressure. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Derek. All right, so we're going to move on to our next segment, which is a panel discussion on the high inflation in Pakistan and its impact on the poor. The panel discussion focuses on appropriate policy options that have been that are there to manage high inflation rates and to mitigate the adverse effects on the poor. So it's aligned with the PDU, and we're looking forward to a discussion on how to respond in the short and medium term to ensure macroeconomic stability while supporting poor households in a fiscal and social sustainable manner. For this discussion, we're joined by a great panel. We've got Dr. Asma Haider. She's the Dean of School of Economics and Social Sciences at IBA Karachi. Thank you, Dr. Asma. We've got Mr. Fida Hussain. He's the Director of the Monetary Policy Department at the State Bank of Pakistan. We've got Dr. Nasir Iqbal, who is an Associate Professor at BIDE and Postdoctoral Fellow at Duke University. Thank you, Mr. Fida and Dr. Nasir. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. So we're now going to move towards our questions. I request all the panelists to keep your answers short. And in case you've prepared a PPT, I will sadly have to say that you cannot use the PPT today, maybe some other time. So we're going to start off with our first question. And I'm addressing it to Mr. Fida Hussain. The real interest rate has been mostly negative since June 2020. It's been like this for a while. And I just have a question. Why has the monetary policy been expansionary for so long? Over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Ariba. So let me start with the what we have already, what has already been discussed, and that is the COVID and pandemic. And as you see, and we all know that the pandemic induced disruptions or led to significant contraction in real output across the globe, and Pakistan was, of course, not the exception. And in Pakistan, we saw, first time in 70 years, we saw a contraction in output in fiscal year 20. So that was the time when, like other many central banks, State Bank of Pakistan acted proactively and aggressively, eased the monetary policy stance during a very short span of time, and besides, State Bank of Pakistan also introduced these were the first time in the history of State Bank of Pakistan that we introduced schemes to support households and businesses during the difficult or challenging times. So what was the result? This helped V-shaped recovery. In 2021, we saw growth rebounding to 5.7%, and then it was sustained in fiscal year 22 as well. So when we were entering in the fiscal year 22, in the start of the fiscal year, our projections were indicating in build-up of inflationary pressures going forward. So State Bank of Pakistan started to tighten the monetary policy stance. So when we were in the midway of our tightening cycle, so our projections suggested uh, uh, showed because let me clarify. I mean, at central bank we see the real interest rate in forward-looking setting. So our projections were suggesting mildly positive real interest rate, but as you know, then after COVID, we saw many shocks hitting the Pakistan economy as they were in the global case as well. And for example, the Russia-Ukraine war that just inflated the already elevated commodity prices and international freight charges. So they just not only added on to the inflation directly, but also increased pressures on exchange rate. So the exchange rate also contributed to the inflation. And then, of course, meanwhile, we increase the so far till July, we had increased the interest rate by 800 basis point, and this coupled with other measures aimed at moderating domestic demand, we saw the results were quite apparent in July 2022 data before the flood started to appear. So we were already seeing the demand coming down, and our projection was suggesting the inflation to come down over the next 12 months. And then, of course, this flood came, and then we saw another supply shock. It is, though, likely to be temporary. If we just go back and look at the 2010 experience, so we can see the impact last about 2 months to 3 months. So we see this is going to be temporary, and as Deputy Governor has already shared our projection and also discussed in our previous monetary policy statement, we see inflation coming down over the next 12 months. So we see this real interest rate is closing, and we will see in forward-looking setting, the interest rate will be in positive territory after 12 months period. Yes, Ariba?
Thank you, Mr. Fida. So the next question, I'm going to direct it towards Dr. Asma. So if inflation impacts all households, which it does, why should policymakers pay special attention to protecting the poor and vulnerable during times of rising prices?
Mhm. Thank you very much, Ariba, and many thanks to all the colleagues for the presentation and comments. I think this report is very important, especially at this time we are facing a lot of pressure, the fiscal pressures, and because of the floods as well. And I think that when we talk about the vulnerabilities, the important thing is basically to understand the dynamics of those vulnerabilities. So I'm happy that the report actually do the analysis at the, for instance, at the food prices and then energy prices, and then what is the core inflation, and finally they also talk about that who is affected more in urban and rural areas. But still, I think that there are some other dynamics. For instance, when we talk about the food, but there is another type of vulnerability, which especially in this climatic shock, which is very common, is the vulnerability due to the bad health and the cases of malaria and so forth. and then again the vulnerability because of the out of school children, which definitely the number of children increased significantly during this time. And then I would say that from when we look from the urban perspective, urban residents perspective, I think the supply chain again actually increase in the vulnerabilities of people if they are urban and even in the rural areas. And finally, the energy prices are also contributing toward the vulnerabilities. So the thing is that for all, considering the dynamics of the vulnerabilities, I think as the report again says, as the Moritz also emphasized on that, that we need a targeted and temporary scheme for that to address these things. So your question that why it's important, I think it's the most important because right now, if I consider a very conservative figure, even then there are almost 20, 25 or 30% people are those who are at the poverty line or below the poverty line, and even the same proportion, almost the same proportion, even considering the very conservative number, the same proportion of those who are in the vulnerable group. And because in Pakistan, even before the COVID-19 crisis, the vulnerable group was it was a quite large group, around 20-25% was the vulnerable group. So now after these three shocks, the COVID-19 shock, war in Ukraine, and now finally the floods, so because we don't have any a strong buffer mechanism, so these vulnerabilities are going to, if not addressed properly and on time, they will lead to very high inequalities. And then uh, definitely there is huge inequality in the society, and we must expect the unrest in society. Um, um, and yeah, it leads to conflict and the lack interest in government, so which emerge even the very serious social issues. And I would reinforce the suggestion that are given by some of the World Bank colleagues. But other than that, so I'm not going to repeat them. For instance, the target subsidy or the cash transfer, which is already the government is doing the 25,000 cash transfer. And but I think that still some of the, for instance, discount that the utility stores probably and vouchers to a targeted group can help even further. And so, and similarly, I think we should also ask the private sector when we look into the urban, especially sector vulnerabilities, or when we look into the vulnerabilities from the production side. I think we should, or maybe the government may think about it to incentivize the private sector to have a more resilient supply chain. Maybe we can think about some type of framework like stress test, as the OECD countries doing. But I'm not saying that definitely being in a developing countries is difficult, but we at least can attempt few things that make our supply chain more resilient. Because during last few years, we have realized that the society like ours, and especially the developing countries, are very much prone to such type of shocks. And finally, I would say that because of the limited space our government have, and already as the report mentioned that there is a huge public debt. But in this short time, government have to manage somehow, and then in the long term, the government may think about taking certain measure toward the austerity or for better fiscal discipline. But I think that there should be a call for the international collaboration on to address this specific calamity at this point in time, because it's also the question of the climate justice. It's not only that we have to address it through our fiscal measure, but it's also about the climate justice, and it's not only because of us and because of the other Western nations. So I and one of my colleagues, probably Moritz, already discussed about the trade facilitation, which is again very much important, and especially so we are only looking at all these things, but there is a huge informal sector which is which is hit by these three shocks, and they are in very much vulnerable condition. And as I said, that it may lead toward the unrest in society, and it's very important to address that. So I stop here, and I would like to have questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Asma. Our next question is for Dr. Nasser. So, building up on what Dr. Asma said about the vulnerable population in Pakistan. So, with households being impacted badly by rising inflation, how do you think that the government can use the existing social safety net programs such as BISP or SAS to support households who are in need and yet be fiscally sustainable? So, over to you.
Thank you so much. I just try to wrap up the previous things, and then I try to suggest few intervention that could be helpful to even fiscally sustainable. So I'll start with one of the recent quote by the World Bank that the zero poverty goal would not be possible to be to met by 2030. This means all the effort that they did over the last few years, they are reversed due to these couple of shocks. One is this the COVID-19 shocks, and another this the fiscal shock. So even if we look into the report that the World Bank launched 2 days, the update that also shows how the poor are resilient to these shocks. If there is a growth rate, the substantial decline in the growth rate, that would lead to a significant increase in the poverty. And I just want to add one more thing. When the Morris presented the finding based on the highest, if we compare the two highest, one is conducted in 2013, another in 2017-18, and if you try to compare with the changes in the growth pattern, it will give you a very interesting picture that despite, as you presented, that the food share is relatively high, but the second important part is they are so vulnerable to these macro shocks. One, what we call, either it's an inflationary shock, either it's a recession in the economy. So if you can also look into this dimension while updating this report. So no, I jump into the what are the existing social protection system available to us, and what we can do, and that are also fiscally sustainable. First, if we look into, there is a massive UCT, as Asma mentioned, that there is a significant share going to poor people through unconditional cash transfer. Then we have this 2F program where we are giving a fuel subsidy, where we are giving a food subsidy. There is also a parallel program run by the government in terms of utility store corporation, and there is a very small chunk of this graduation program. So these are all meant to reduce the vulnerability of the poor people, but the way they are targeted, they are not optimal. So if we look into the cost of implementation of this foods program, either it's implemented by the utility store corporation, either it is implemented by the food ration program. They have a very high cost. But if we look into the other food program, that is a UCT, it's also a food support program. The cost of that program is relatively low. So here we need to think the way how we can merge all these programs and come up with a one fiscally sustainable program. The way I think as the way forward, we have a two type of approach. One is at the macro level, as most of the panelists said. In macro level, if we go very specific, first we have to think about the role of this public investment. Second, we have to identify the crops, those give a quick return to the farmer rather than giving a substitute to the entire agriculture sector. We have to identify the cash crop. Third, we have to increase the connectivity. What Pi says is the internet for all, digital connectivity, but this is the era of digital connectivity. If we really want to increase the resilience of these poor people, we have to give them the right of this connectivity. So these are the three broad the categories of the intervention at the macro level. Now we come to the micro level. I'll suggest two specific intervention here too. One, we have to move away from this unconditional cash transfer to a more conditional cash transfer in terms of graduation. Because if you don't create diversify the portfolio of their income generating activity, it will be very difficult to sustain in the long run. So we have to give away this cash transfer and keep it a very small, and try to increase the portfolio of the graduation program. And there is already intervention going on in the country. Another intervention that I would suggest, I would propose a package-based social protection system. What I mean to package-based social protection system, just look into the example of mobile package. If I need a connectivity, data usage, I'll prefer any package that be a more facilitating in terms of giving me the internet connectivity. If I have to make a more call, then I prefer a package that give a facility in terms of more minutes to make a call or a text. So I should choose the package based on my needs. So in this context, I suppose to present four different packages that would be really helpful one is to reduce the overall social the fiscal burden, to increase the chances to graduate and increase the resilience power of these people. First package would be the employment intensive package, where the main focus should be like a technical training to youth and especially to women, and try to enhance the opportunities and engage in the value chain. So this would be only focused on the employment with some. So of course, you can say that like food sport as well. Then the next package would be the education intensive package, where the focus would be to ensure that every kid within the household would have or to have a facility to get at any level of education that he or she wants. So this put a lot of effort in terms of giving an education, so that every kid should be enrolled and the stipend channelized through the institution. The third package would be the health, especially for the elder people, especially for the disabled people, and they need a lot of health support. So that must cover indoor as well outdoor the need of the people. Because if we only cover indoor, it would be very difficult for the poor people to get out of to pay out of pocket expense. The third, of course, is the food extent intensive package, where there is always a portion the segment of the society that always need these type of support, and we should have to identify and let the household to decide which package work best for these households. So this will the last these packages, one will increase your the coverage, increase the targeting efficiency, it will minimize the cost of implementation, and also improve the consumer sovereignty. So the consumer basically decide what actually he has to go for. The last 2 point I would really like to focus on the women and youth specific intervention and the opportunities that we can create. So if we look into the women specific activities, livelihood, the key issue that we are focusing is we are just giving them like we are giving them sewing machine, we are trying to push them to run their kitchen and the grow the livestock. These are the very outdated, though there is some potential, but these are the outdated trade where we are pushing these women. We have to identify the new trade. For example, hoteling, marketing, packaging. These are the new trade where we really need to engage our women and especially youth and give them the training. Similarly, access of the women to the potential market is a big challenge, and we have to address this. Looking at the way, even if we look into the street vending, there is a very small portion of women working over there. Even if the women want to install a small coca, it would be very difficult. So we have to create some sort of potential market for these women. So, the third one is specifically related to the women and the youth. We have to increase their social skills. This is the era of communication, marketing, conflict management, business strategies, among all others. So we have to increase the soft skill. The last is in terms of youth. So we have to reduce the cost of starting business. That is very high, especially the input cost is very high in terms of the as Pied advocated many times that the sludge and the documentation would be very difficult for these poor people, and they create a lot of hurdle for them to start even a very small business. The lastly, I just reiterate the hub model of the street economy or street vending. Pi did a lot of work, and our studies coming out on this. But kind of the benefit they are getting, they are even earning more than the 2 times the minimum wage rate that prevailing in the country. So these are the street vendors. So we have to find a mechanism where these street vendors can be accommodated, especially in the urban area. Asma highlighted the issue of the urban poverty. So we have to revisit this whole paradigm of development and start rethinking the process of development, because I again start with the first line, that is that all the effort that put in the last 30 40 years went waste with the one shock. So I'll stop it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to my next set of questions. Just a reminder to the audience that you can send in your questions for our panelists and you can hear their responses. So my next question is back at Mr. Fida. So do you think the monetary policy stance should be adjusted in response to the devastating floods, given the current context, or the very high inflation that we're witnessing? So just some uh,
Okay.
insights on that.
So this is difficult for me to tell you. And MPC is meeting on 10th on Monday. So it is the Monetary Policy Committee that actually decides on the monetary policy stance. But as I just discussed before, what our projections suggest is the inflation is coming down over next 12 months. They Yes, there are floods, and it has added to the food inflation, as you can also feel. The perishable food items, especially, not only perishable, but no, we see some essential food items prices are also rising. So there is a impact of temporary. There is an impact of flood that I just said that it is likely to be temporary, and we see it will recede as the next crop, fresh produce on the next crop comes. So at the same time, what we see now is, if we just look at the global economic conditions, so the global economy is slowing. The central banks are increasing the interest rates, so global demand is going down. So it is likely to have favorable impact on commodity prices going forward. So we are looking at. You might have seen at the oil prices. A month ago they were trading around $100 per barrel. Now they are below 90. So this is one of the example. And then similarly, the other food items prices in global market are on the downtrend now. So they will definitely contribute going forward to help lower food inflation, or supply side inflation, what we call the food and energy component. And of course, if we just look at the past, uh, look at the performance of the Monetary Policy Committee. So they always uh, act on a very timely manner, and as per required. As so Let me share with you one more thing. Whenever the Monetary Policy Committee meets to decide on the monetary policy stance, so they look at a broader set of economic variable. They look at the broader macroeconomic outlook. So that includes the assessment of floods, their impact on inflation, their impact on growth and economic activity, and of course the difficult job of policymakers is to strike a delicate balance that help to not only to contain and to anchor inflation expectation, but also to ensure that the growth prospects are not compromised. As taking cue from the discussion from the other respectable panelists. So if you can imagine, if inflation is high but people have income or employment, so maybe they can bear. But if the inflation is also high and they are unfortunately unemployed, so then the impact of inflation will be even severe. So with this, I will stop here. So over to Ari.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Asma. So, beyond direct support through well targeted social safety nets, what policy options do you propose for the government right now to respond to the rising prices in the short term? So, a short term solution, please.
Yeah, for Ariba, thank you for the question. For short-term solutions, especially right now we are facing this flood crisis. So I suggest that there is also a question on inequalities as well. So I will address that along with your question. So for short-term solution, as we discussed earlier, that the nature of vulnerabilities is very different. For instance, if we first of all consider nutritional inequalities and how to address that issue, and similarly the health issue. So short-term solution maybe number one to give the vouchers and discounts at the utility store so that people can get the food item at least. And for health, maybe I was just thinking today, and I just looked into the literature as well. And one solution can be in very short term to assign the doctors to certain places which are where the people are highly flood affected. So I think they here the government and the civil hospital should take lead on that. And secondly, the education. If we look into the education, that how, because so many schools are basically the shelters for the flood affected people. Some are completely abolished. So I think this is something where the temporary camps can be settled, or something like that can be done. These are actually very very hard question, and the final thing probably is that. As we as in the beginning, Murtaza also mentioned about the tightening monetary policy, which is definitely, which is very important at that point in time. But still, I think the state bank can do certain intervention through, for instance, commercial banks by giving the soft loans only to the firms and to the promising entrepreneurs. And similarly, the agriculture banks can give the soft loans and targeted loans for those who want to buy the fertilizers and seeds, because everything right now is abolished. As we know that one third of the country is now underwater and everything is gone. So I think these are some of the temporary things that should be done on immediate basis, and then maybe later on, as Nasir suggested, we can continue with certain things.
Thank you, Dr. Asma. Next question is for Dr. Nasser. As the floods are expected to have a profound impact on household welfare, which policy options can the government use to support poor households as a part of reconstruction plans?
Thank you so much. So, first, I did a study on this, what people really feel about the climate change and the crisis, and the lack of awareness that they have is one of the big challenge. The next key issue for us to the right targeting and the right disbursement for the amount. So for that, we have to go for this shock sensitive social protection system. In my earlier talk, I just try to highlight we have to look for a shock sensitive targeting method. And for that, I mean we have to incorporate these things into the modeling framework. And once we have these, we can quickly disperse. As we suggested a lot of time to the base and the poverty division, that how they can revisit this targeting method to increase optimally these. The another, as I said, we have to focus on the cash crops very quickly. These are the adjustment where they can easily accommodate. So rather than giving a subsidy to all, or the pushing to the all sector, we have to identify the activities within that sector. This is the standard method to optimally channelize these things. So we have to focus on these lines rather than giving a lot of study. And there is another question from the chat as well, that what about the direct subsidy? So I think this is the time we have to revisit this term of subsidy rather than putting a lot of money in this channel, like we are giving. We are subsidizing our energy sector. We are subsidizing even food through this utility store corporation. But look at the quality and the service delivery of these people. So we have to think differently. There is a lot of wastage of resources when we use these channel, and as Morris also highlighted in the discussion, that we have to rationalize these subsidies, and especially in the energy sector, if we really want to be a more sustainable, more resilient. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser. So we're going to move on to audience questions. But Dr. Nasser has already answered one of the questions that we've already got for him, which was what are your views on having direct subsidies for food for the poor? And Dr. Asma already answered one of her questions where she was asked, do you think crises like the pandemic and floods have increased inequality in Pakistan? So now we're going to move on to Dr. Fida with Mr. Fida for a question. Um, all right. So my question is, how can the banking sector help in mitigating the impacts of inflation on the poor people and urban middle class in Pakistan? Because the state bank's a regulator of the banking sector. I just love to hear your thoughts on that.
So one of the the way central bank can actually help uh, the urban population is by controlling inflation, keeping it low and stable. That is the reason d'etre for central bank, the very purpose of central bank. So so of course, this is where across all. If you just look at the globally, all the central banks are fighting to fighting inflation, and they are raising the interest rates to control inflation. This is one of the way. And the other way is, of course, what we mean uh, did during the pandemic is that ensure that the economic activity is going on, and we provide a stable environment where where the economic activity just flourishes, creates employment opportunities, and and provides the as the labor, as we know, the new entrant in the labor market, they keep on adding or coming to the labor market. So for that purpose, you need to see economic activity, so that there are ample opportunities for the young and new entrants in the labor market. So first, of course, is through controlling the inflation, and if inflation is overall, uh, stable and low and stable, or within the target. So then the second where central bank can actually support is through providing more stable stable environment for economic activity. So this is these are the, because depending on the tools we have, uh, as we were discussing, as the other panelists were discussing about the social protection, that is the job of the government. And of course, we saw during the pandemic, as well as during the high inflation period, government is trying to reach out to the poor through SRs or Benazir Income Support Fund. So that is more from the government side. Yes, Hariba?
Thank you, Mr. Fida. So while we have a lot of questions coming in, but we have gone over time significantly, so we've got to cut this short. So with this, I'd like to thank all my panelists. Thank you, Mr. Fida. Thank you, Dr. Asma. And thank you, Dr. Nasir, for taking out the time. And I'd love to thank the lovely audience for keeping us engaged with your questions, with your feedback. So thank you to the viewers that have tuned in today to watch this event. The recording will be available on social media platforms appearing on the screen. Do not forget to tweet about us using the hashtags hashtag PTUFall2022 or hashtag inflation in Pakistan. With that, I'd just like to thank my panelists again. I'd like to thank the World Bank team and Tabat Lab. And just a reminder, the complete report will be available on the World Bank website, the World Bank Pakistan website, for you all to read. We've already had a sneak peek. Now it's your time. But thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you. Nafis.
Thank you.
Thank you.